Welcome everybody. Thanks for bearing with us while we're setting up some technical things. It's good to see you all again. And now that we've gotten situated, I'll introduce myself. My name is Emilio Dottore. I'm the Executive Director of the Milwaukee Turners. This exciting virtual forum, the third of three important monthly forums on food and land justice, is being hosted jointly in a special partnership by the Milwaukee Turners and the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee's Center for 21st Century Studies, with support from Racism Milwaukee, MICA, the National Lawyers Guild of Milwaukee, Turning Tables Tavern, and Wisconsin Voices. This forum is being broadcast on both Zoom and on the Milwaukee Turners Facebook page, and we invite you to share the live feed to your own Facebook pages using the link provided in the chat, or if you pop over to the Milwaukee Turners Facebook page. This way others can share and learn from this important conversation. It's being recorded and will be shared in the near future also, so that you can work with the video. We understand that there are folks watching this in a group fashion. We've been contacted by many who can't be here simultaneously, so know that there are many folks who would like to see this important message and share it too. Before we begin, I'd like to review a few logistics to ensure our forum is accessible to everyone. Captioning is available. If you click on the live transcript CC icon to use captioning or to turn it off, then click show subtitle. You can click view full transcript to see the full captioning stream also. ASL interpreters are available through Derekanian and DJC Interpreting. And if you need to communicate directly with the interpreter, note that in the chat and we will reply to you directly. We ask speakers to please say their name each time they speak to help with accessibility. And also everybody, feel free to use the chat feature throughout the briefing if you need assistance. This includes on Facebook, and we will monitor the chat so that those questions can be elevated and shared with our distinguished panelists. With that, it's my pleasure to turn it over to Nicole Welk-Yeager. Thank you.
Thanks, Emilio. Welcome, everyone, to the third and final roundtable conversation of our spring program titled Nourishing Trust, Considering How Food and Land Connects Us. Now, Milwaukee Turners has a rich history with the 19th century sound mind and a sound body motto, echoing various programs of the organization today. Founded a bit later in 1968, the Center for 21st Century Studies, or C21. Our mission has been to build a community of scholars to address the pressing issues of our time. We are humanities at heart and interdisciplinary in action. As our charter says, quote, cooperative humanistic research is most compatible with the task of addressing the complexity of 21st century challenges, unquote. And complex they are, with collaborations like this one essential as we tackle the pressing issues, food and land being an anchor of our discussion today. So in Milwaukee, we acknowledge that we continue to occupy traditional Potawatomi, Ho-Chunk, and Menominee homeland along the southwest shores of Michigami, North America's largest system of freshwater lakes, where the Milwaukee, Menominee, and Kinnickinnic rivers meet, and the people of Wisconsin's sovereign Anishinaabe, Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Oneida, and Mohican nations remain present. I'm Nicole Welk-Yeager, Deputy Director of C21, and part of an amazing team that makes everything possible today. Many thanks to them and our co-hosts, the Milwaukee Turners, for embracing and shaping this new format of what was once our annual conference, now with multiple points of access and engaging multiple ways of knowing. We invite you to engage with C21's many programs in this mission, including our podcast series, 6.5 Minutes With, our interactive book club, where you'll find suggestions of things to read and view to go deeper into this year's and last year's topics, and this year's participatory project, a survey about the journeys we make to gather, prepare, and consume food. And finally, the series of roundtable conversations. So today we will talk with two leaders in food and land justice initiatives, so we might learn from them, their projects and affiliated organizations about the role of trust in bringing these initiatives into action. I'm thrilled and thankful to welcome these incredible people who are part of this conversation. And we're just hearing now that unfortunately Linda Black Elk will not be joining us today, but Joshua Rutherford, who's part of the C21 team, is going to share out a few links about her incredible work as a part of food sovereignty efforts. in North Dakota. So I will introduce Anton Seals Jr., who is here with us, a lead steward of Grow Greater Englewood in Chicago, in conversation with Brittany Koteles, director of Nuns and Nones, that's spelled Nuns and Nones, Land Justice Project here in Milwaukee. Thank you so much, both of you, for joining us today. And I thought that we could get started with some brief self-introductions, just 2 or 3 minutes about the movements you're part of and the organizations that you're helping lead. So Anton, you are the lead steward of Grow Greater Englewood. Please tell us about your work. And I know there's been some exciting developments.
There has. Good afternoon, everybody. Anton Seals Jr. here, co-founder and lead steward of Grow Greater Englewood. Our work here in Chicago, on the south side of Chicago, in the Greater Englewood community, which are 2 neighborhoods, Englewood and West Englewood, predominantly African-American neighborhood, about over 90% population African-American. Probably in the imagination of people, what they think of when they think of a hood in Chicago, it might be Englewood now in the most modern sense. So where a lot of the current pop culture music kind of derives from, the drill and all, that's this neighborhood. That's where it comes from. That's where those artists are from. So there's a kind of larger context there. And in there, our work kind of really began around organizing, around really looking at some of the things that were missing, particularly around the food system and food access work, and also just land, the amount of vacant land because of the divestment that had happened in urban spaces, in particular on the south side of Chicago, like in Englewood, where you had light manufacturing or those kind of industries kind of evaporate. Starting, I would say, with the after the Second World War, where you started to see the suburbanization of American cities, and then followed in large part by white flight, right? So these communities were settled by first generation Americans who were European descent, Lithuanian, German, Irish, and this community had its huge intersection around the railroads as well. So there's a deep history of this neighborhood, which is called Junction Grove. And just like what made Chicago emerge as America's second city is because of all of these intersections of the center. As why wasn't it Milwaukee, or at one point it was St. Louis? Well, Chicago ended up emerging because of this intersection between Mississippi up to Canada, out or further, and then east to west, right? So that is still the nexus of the history of Englewood. And so fast forward to the kind of work, I didn't grow up in Englewood. I am from another South Side neighborhood called South Shore. So I grew up right next to Lake Michigan, which is straight down 41 from Milwaukee. So it's like not that far. It's a straight shot, actually, like one road. So it's just maybe about, I want to say 10, maybe 8 miles just east of Englewood. But my family is from the larger Englewood community. I lived in Englewood, and then I also worked in Englewood. So that was to kind of brings me to the placement of like how I ended up here, and how I ended up in food system was through policy. I worked for Congressman Rush for several years. So we did a lot of work to codify what we now, which is still terrible, food desert terminology, but was necessary to evoke a new conversation around what now we call racial equity and racial justice, language that did not exist even 20 years ago, that are now part of the lexicon in our American cities and across this country, quite frankly, around that push. And so that's kind of where Grow Greater Englewood started in terms of reclaiming spaces, in particular for Black culture and Black people, leaning in on what does that really mean when we say we're improving, communities, reconnecting and reaffirming the African, largesse of who we are in the global community as the earth stewards of the world, the original earth stewards. Like some of that had gotten stripped because of the transatlantic slave trade. So the kind of overarching, so we see this as a larger kind of diasporic effort that also connects us in terms of like what the largesse of the Black community, African community worldwide, which has been labeled, castigated in the global community around those tropes or things of less than, right? Because of the color of our skin, right? And we all know, so that's a whole nother piece, but that is essentially what our thesis is, to kind of address some of that through actions of what we have currently in our own community. So it just whittles right back down to like what we can take really advantage of that's right in front of us. And that's such an American, and it's African Americans, right? So like we're not an immigrant community. So there's the history of like we built and fed this country. So it's just really building on the real legacy of who we are, like why so many Black people are even in Chicago is they all fled the southern states, in particular Mississippi and Alabama and Arkansas, because of open racism. Right. And so now what we're dealing with is the kind of neglect of the open racism in the northern cities. So now we're creating a new chart of like, well, and what nature does is replenish, because these are just stories, of course, we all know in the human village, we all have these different stories. And so what nature is, the great teacher, is the leveler. It levels us all out because it kind of engulfs us. And so this trail that we're working on is about 2 miles long and connects on the south side. It's on the south side, and it sits between CXX and Norfolk Southern Railroads. And in between was at one point some kind of light manufacturing kind of district that serviced that connector rail. But it's been closed for over 50 years. So basically my entire life, maybe a little less. I'll give myself some, a little leeway there, but it has not been in use. And so what has already just naturally occurred, which was just nature reclaiming the spaces when humans don't touch it. Right. So the amount of cottonwoods, the topography of the community, the natural native species, and just what the birds and the bees actually do themselves, which is moving and fertilizing around, these different native plants and species and weeds, what we would call. So our work has really been to kind of use this as a process to kind of transform not only the trail, but then the vacant lots that we then help prepare for community farmers who have gone through processes of being trained to run their own small commercial farms, right? But we didn't just stop there. We also kind of interconnected it to the work of community gardens of growers, because we know that is also very much present in terms of the community gardens, people growing in their own backyards. So really kind of looking at food security and insecurity from a different point of view, and then the food system, and then how that intersects with the conservation and climate action that we need to really address. And I would close by saying, like, one of the things that we're really focused on is because, in Chicago, we have this 10-year lifespan difference, and Englewood 60621 was used in that case study, in a few different studies actually, around the life expectancy. And a lot of that gets at like the lack of what and how the environment is such a huge part of that health equity component. And that's a social determinant for health. You know what I mean? Having access to more open parks, to trees, to recreation, that is appropriate, that is detached from some of the ideas of even like what that means in terms of the larger white culture, and that they can be redefined around a broader culture, right? That there's room in there, that there are things that people are already doing. So those are the kind of things that we're working on at Grow Greater Englewood. I hope that didn't take up too much time, but and I'll pass the mic over to Brittany.
Yeah, the same question to Brittany, just kind of giving a little bit of introduction to Nuns and Nones, the land justice effort. And as we're making that transition, just wow, Anton, thank you so much for kind of giving like the history is so important as well, for speaking to how health equity issues, food equity issues, and climate justice are all part of the work that's happening there. And I hope we can have a larger conversation about what that means for food justice definitions. But I turn it over to Brittany about Nuns and Nones. Thank you for being here.
Thanks, Nicole. Thanks, Anton, for setting it up. I'm like, I can't wait to make that drive down 41 and visit you sometime. Hi, everybody. My name is Brittany. I'm with the Nuns and Nones Land Justice Project. It's a mouthful. And I also live here in Milwaukee on Ho-Chunk, Potawatomi, and Menominee land. Thanks for that beautiful land acknowledgement, Nicole. I'll just quickly tell a 30-minute background story as to why I have this long organizational name attached to our work. So I've been a part of interfaith organizing for all of my adult life, and Nuns Nones was originally a project of encounter between Catholic sisters and mostly non-religious younger activists who have this nickname of the Nuns, Nones, because most of us check none of the above in the question about religion in the census or whatever. And the impetus for those encounters was really a desire from both sides to explore forms of alternative community that are in service of justice and driven by spirit. And it kind of blew my mind just how radical the life and economic structures of Catholic sisters could be. From that, so that larger kind of space of encounter has been going on for 6 years. And from that kind of grew and spun out this land justice project, which came out of this deep concern of Catholic sisters, both for the work around climate change and dismantling racism. And in all of the ministry work that Catholic sisters were doing, there was this other question. There's this other question coming up for many religious communities, which has to do with letting go of land and assets as their demographics shift and they become smaller. The average age of a Catholic sister is 82 years old in this country. And so there's a big question up in many communities about what is the future of these lands that we have loved for generations going to be. It's a hard question. It's a tender question. And the Nuns Nones Land Justice Project, and I'll just call it the Land Justice Project from now on, kind of was, an answer to that question of how could this question about the future of land be more woven into questions about climate and race. And from there, we've built a really beautiful learning community. Members of over 100 religious communities, Catholic sisters in the United States have joined our work. And what we do is we provide education and we accompany communities to kind of restart the property planning process from a place of racial and ecological healing. In this country today, 98% of land, of private land and of rural land, 95% of urban land is owned by white people. 1,500 acres of rural land are developed every day. And just generally, we live in a paradigm in which whoever has the most money gets to decide what happens to the land. And that is, so our question for groups of people connected to the Catholic Church, the largest private landowner in the world, we really think that like not only in a parcel by parcel, like how can this land, how can the decisions that religious communities make about land be in active, place-based, in active healing and repair for the earth, and an act that restores relationship to the people who have been most denied access to land. And beyond just the place-based intervention that each property plan can be, how can we actually culturally tell this story in a way that disrupts the entire way that we're thinking about property, which is fundamentally flawed at its very core. So that's kind of the larger vision of the work. And what it looks like day to day is walking with communities who are saying, yeah, we want to do this differently. We don't know how. We don't we're going to learn together. We study different case studies of land repair, land return, rematriation. I can talk a little bit about those as we go on if we want to go down that road. But generally, it's like yeah, we're building a community of communities that are committing to asking this question in a different way.
Thank you, Brittany. There's just so much to talk about. And I'm the first thing that comes to mind is first we have a podcast that's up this week by Leah Penniman for about her book Black Earth Wisdom, and talking about spirituality and the land. And it's so interesting, Anton, that your label is steward, and the idea of stewardship and the religious connotations of that terminology, and how it's like wrapped up in taking care of the land, but also in these like very old Abrahamic traditions of property too. And I'm just like the connections between you two, I'm really excited about talking more with both of you. So I do have these questions that I prepared, but any reactions before I go into those questions?
I mean, Leah several years ago came and, blessed the land, and performed ritual on the land. So, we've had, and I think this is because this is kind of grown out of like an organizing strategy as opposed to like an economic development strategy from a city. It's like we brought the city along, right? So I think for us, it's also then, pushing back against the narrative, because this is an infrastructure reuse project, there's a group of us in the Highline Network. So those are, the much broader kind of like snazzier spaces, but it gets at like, I think what you're talking about, which is, how do we then really look at like, what is reclamation? And then the stewardship piece was very intentional around, versus ownership.
Yeah.
Because, and it gets to a more spiritual that, humans don't own the earth. We return to it. And we often forget that because we're living in a framework that commodifies the land. But, the earth is older than that system, so that, that it's the true teller that, we have all these other beliefs, but we all know that you return to the land. So that is also part of like that cycle, that we're part of the earth. You know what I mean? So, just like the plants and the trees, like we are also part of, that system. So that is for us, when it gets all like in the weeds of all of this stuff, that we kind of just center ourselves back to that, to the fire, to the air, to the soil, that's like, because that's not always the spaces that I'm in, you know what I mean? So, but that's the spaces that we are rooted in.
Mm-hmm.
All of us, you know what I mean? And that's the leveler
as
humans, you know what I mean? But it's not like to just make it generic or banal, because we have these differences in these systems, you know what I mean? So I am a Black man in America, like that context is important, right? Yeah. So that's what, I'm hoping that, it's more of that, this connectivity in our for America, actually, because that's what we have to do to heal our country.
Absolutely. And it's kind of getting into how food and land really is this great connector, and the land itself, the dirt itself, absolutely in this context. And it's really powerful. I wonder if we can bridge the conversation between you two, not just on the fact of stewardship, but also hearkening back to the other two roundtables we had for this series. And through the podcast series too, we were asking everyone, what does food and land justice mean to you? What does it mean to you? So, and both of your organizations take very different approaches to this topic. And so I'm wondering, what does food and land justice ultimately look like to you? And how do you see that coming out of your practice, trying to harness in and getting into those like particular stories about how this is coming to pass from the day to day in both groups? I kick it back to you.
Anton, you want to go first, or?
I don't want to like hog, but I think that the question is, I think there's a few things. I think like the interconnection with the community is, our community has dealt with so much. So there's just so like, and I'm still fascinated by what Brittany was sharing around like the ownership of, before I even go into my spiel, around the ownership of religious groups owning so much land, from like in Chicago would be like Catholic Church to these smaller churches, which is you kind of got me spinning on that, because that ended up being a really growth industry in the 90s. And I don't know if there's any research around that in terms of the faith. A lot of churches, we often hear, these storefront churches, and that basis of that history in Black America is really interesting around how religion was, adopted. And then how they ended up, acquiring so much space also in, even impoverished Black communities, or just Black communities, period, like the mega church and the corner store churches. So it got me thinking, like, because they did end up owning, in Chicago at least, a lot of land in, the 90s. That's since changed. But it definitely is something that I think is a big influence. Now, going back to the community kind of question, I think that you were asking around, how do we integrate that? Is that the question again? Just to make sure I don't riff off too far.
Just so how food land justice, what it looks like to you and how it's coming out in practice. So in the integrating of community, do you have stories of what this looks like, or it could look like?
Yeah, I think, I've been around this space for almost 20 years now. So, which is like, wow, how did that happen? But, how we think about it, this whole industry around food insecurity or food apartheid, or how food has become politicized, is fascinating as well. Like, who's been brought to the conversation around the kind of simplicity of eating, right? But I do think that the one piece that I'm seeing in this, like the reclamation of like why this land is like taking the land and makes, especially in the urban setting, right, and making great use of it. Now, for us, we've thought about this from a systems approach, and so I end up wearing a lot of different hats. Like, I'm basically executive director of this organization that I founded, but I also chair the Chicago Food Policy Action Council. And I chair several other kind of organizations that I've been a part of that have kind of grown, not just in this space, but around advocacy and around these issues around land, not just stewardship, but also just land reclamation as well. And I think where I think that there's the community and how this narrative has shifted is particularly since the pandemic, is that there's a lot more attention being paid to access to food, access to public land, who should be able, what does that repair or reparations really look like when it's just starkly obvious. I think the confrontation of that conversation in our country is so housed in race. And I often think about this because, like, in a state like Illinois, where you have like the farmland, it's essentially such a wildly different approach to, the city of Chicago, which is this big metropolitan space, and just the imagination of people, right? It's like a New York or Chicago, it's big. And then you get to like Rantoke, Illinois, or, you're going to a really small Macomb, Illinois, right? And because we work in a sector around agriculture and the earth workers, there's so many intersections that I think are just mind-blowing beyond race. So what we've discovered, what we know is, like, many rural farm town communities mimic urban communities in terms of all of the kind of different, there's some slight differences, but they, the poverty issue is there, the issue around education, access to information, access to food is different, mobility is different, access to even the internet now, you know what I mean? So when we visit or have gone there, we see that these issues around, but the big difference, the kind of 800-pound gorilla, is like how they acquired the land to begin with, is a conversation that usually does not come up for most white Americans, right? Because in that is embedded that is the gift, and everyone knows it, including one, and that's the big kind of like, the shame, right? In a sense, right? Or the extra proudness of, in a sense, that, we got this land and we took care of it, right? And in that was also the losers whose land that was. So this gets into the kind of the component around the indigenous. So I think that like those stories have now started to emerge in our, American culture that, because of the outcomes of them, that everything is so skewed in terms of who has the access. So when we start to try to deal with some of these issues, we're trying to just give like little band-aids. And part of it is like, the tension is like people who've benefited, who may not even think that they've benefited, are like, why should I have to give something up? Right. So that tension, I think, still remains. And in an urban setting, when you start talking about food and farming in an urban setting, it's nice, it's kind of très chic, but people don't also connect it to a larger kind of economic system, or a system that also connects to heal the earth. Right. So I think that that's kind of like where I think that there's this energy especially in our city right now. We just elected, like, the people beat in Chicago the money. Right. And as fraught as that is in terms of unions and all of the but there's a level of solidarity that can emerge. It will require a lot of work and leaning in, and a lot of grace and openness, which are different values than I'm going to take charge and we're going to just make things happen. It's like charting the unknown, like you don't always know what happens. And that's okay. And can we be intentional around learning from that? So these are different frames in terms of how we would be developing, or you know what I mean? So that to me is what's really excited around what we can continue to push around, what we will leave behind for our children and their connection to the earth and people in the earth. So that's what kind of is driving me. I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, and I'm looking at the chat here, which has some activity, and just the highlight to the solidarity dividend, and seeing how people come together. I think, speaking to solidarity and the connections, Anton, you've mentioned the connections between urban and rural through struggle and human struggle, and how that gets mapped onto different geographic spaces. But then the capacity and who initiates and owns a sacrifice as well. What do you sacrifice in those efforts to create that solidarity? That's really a beautiful angle and approach to thinking about this kind of justice work. I point the question back to you, Brittany, responding to Anton, and also talking about what's happening with the Land Justice Initiative.
Yeah. Before I forget, Anton, you were talking about just churches in general, and particularly storefront churches and the Black church. And there's just some great work that Heber Brown is doing with the Black Church Food Security Network, really leveraging part of the work of the Black church to be hosting to be the land base of Black food sovereignty. His website, and Heber will speak about it better than I, but just to kind of connect some other dots from what you said at the top. Oh, there's so much that I want to say. I'll start with, this word that you're using, Anton, of reclamation feels really important on a lot of different levels. There's in the United States today, reclamation represents, for us, when we define land justice to our network, to our community, which is mostly sisters and folks that are affiliated with religious communities. When I say religious community, there's avowed religious community, just to kind of clarify, from communities of, it's a particular Catholic phrase. But we talk about land justice being the protection of land, the regeneration of the land's health, and the expanding of equity, access, tenure, governance, and relationship to people who have been most dispossessed of that, who have been taken away from the land by this economy and this structure. So there's a part of reclamation that's very straightforward, which is that repair of access and governance, right? It's not just having access to a vacant lot, as I'm sure you know, Anton. It's how do we know we can be here? No one's going to pull this out from under us. No one's going to change their mind. No one's going to decide to develop it. But because, yeah, so it's protecting that as well in this work. And so there's that act of reclamation that we're trying to support by finding communities that want to redistribute that access and control, by saying, you know what, this system is not fair, and we are going to participate in the broader work of reclamation, in the reclamation of a more whole relationship of human beings to the rest of the living world, by supporting the kind of parcel by parcel reclamation of what's needed. If that makes sense, it's like there's you were talking about this, humans don't own the land, Anton, you were saying that. It's like there's a deeper reclamation of, Robin Wall Kimmerer talks about species loneliness in her writing, this idea that as the mainstream, certainly not the only, but a mainstream human paradigm of domination, very largely based on race, also class and gender and all these things, but like that paradigm of domination has not only created a destructive economy that's destroying the earth, but it's created this phenomenon of species loneliness that like we actually don't know how to be right with the rest of it all. And so I see those two kind of levels of reclamation as so connected to each other. It's like we're not going to get to that bigger repaired thing if we can't even look at how it's alive in this system and change it. So I very much see that act of repair and that decision of redistributing resources and saying, we're going to make that choice from a place of healing. That is such an active and necessary role in the ecosystem of it all. And I think it's like, so we do a lot of the work around just re-educating, like relearning our history and centering the conversation about the future of the land in the real reality of land injustice. And history has come up a lot. And I know another conversation really rooted in that as part of the series, but it's like, how do we get clear on what's going on and what's not okay? And then how do we, try to make neutral, like what are the actual options for moving land into a different, to bring new stewards in who again have been removed from land very intentionally by the system. I mean, you're talking about, and this is the last thing I'll say just to draw another connection here, but Anton, you said, you started by saying this migration from the South because of racial terror is why we're rerouting this land stewardship work in a place like Chicago. And I know Leah Penniman talks about this all the time, like 14% of all US farmland in the 1920s was owned by Black people. And because of these terror campaigns, that's less than 1% today. Like post-Civil War, 14%. And it's not like it wasn't because that Black people never owned land in this country. It was a huge, like, and I know I'm speaking to the choir here, Anton, but just for our community here, like that happened because of an active campaign of terror and, deception and all kinds of things that brought that land base down. So anyway, again, just like the reclamation on one level is what's going to make possible the deeper reclamation that we just need if we want a livable planet.
I mean, seriously, you just you got me thinking, because I got involved in this work, and God rest his soul, was a brilliant lawyer here in Chicago that worked with Congressman Rush's office, and he had a project we started called ROSA, the Reclamation of Southern Assets. And it had fizzled, but it was my entry point because my family is from Grenada, Mississippi. So oftentimes people think about, what that process was when people left the South.
Yeah.
And, the level of like what people had in terms of ownership, you know what I mean, in different spaces. And like in a place like Grenada, like even what you're talking about in terms of like why people ended up leaving was because there were economic gains being made or there was sectioned off. So it wasn't like that Black people initially all wanted to be integrated either. They did not. Because there was a deep fear because of the kind of terroristic things that went unchecked for years that are deeply traumatic to the Black psyche still to this day. right? And so that's where the extra chip is like, you know, in the larger conversation, is particular for Black people, right? As opposed to, you know, all people, like, you know, people always say, well, everybody experiences, yes, but there was a level of like things that were done that were never compensated for, right? So even if you think about those kind of things that were happening, and then the land that folks had, and it didn't dawn on me till I started working, it was like when people came north, that, you know, the kind of nefarious actions of taking people's land and then getting timber rights and making money off of other folks' land, you know, quote unquote, even in this kind of system that we have of capitalism, and or that there's, you know, real estate, and how much wealth was generated by those who then, you know, couldn't claim their land, right? And that the whole system, from the judicial system, the clerks, like, that were all in collusion to be like, no, you can't have this. Oh, y'all left. I couldn't find any. Like, that stuff just never transversed my thought process of like all these Black people living in Chicago, right? And yeah, and somebody said, and the USDA in collusion with that. So it just kind of like, that was my entry point, because like not everybody was necessarily running large farms, but it didn't, and that's what kind of really brought me into this work, was like, oh, this is part of my legacy, right? That like we left, and in our family there still is like, and I'm third generation away, like I think I've been to Grenada, Mississippi like twice, you know what I mean? But that was our family's land, right? And so you think about that as a basis in American culture for how, you know, the largesse of white communities have. Now, I'm not saying that like there's no Black people that have done it, because there have to be, of course, you know what I mean? But the general, you know, response 100 years ago now at this point was people were fleeing this space because of lack of opportunity. And that's kind of the same thing that's happened now in the urban setting, because there's been no jobs, and jobs have now become much more automated and much more highly technical, right? But they really aren't that technical. Like that's really not that difficult. Like once humans can learn and adapt quite well when you allow them to have the opportunity to do such.
Right.
So that's like the misnomer, like it doesn't take you to do, like, then I think that's where we kind of are, what the next generation will be, is even bolder, are demanding of things that, but then there's this kind of, also I think in what you were saying is like, there has to be a space like when you can be right about something, but it's also like, you can be so right about something that you can actually be wrong about how you think about, like, you know, like then, you know, what's the expectation for largesse of white culture to actually do? You know what I mean? And that's kind of where it gets stuck, is like, you know, people are still people. They're like, well, I don't have anything, you know, so it becomes much more individual.
Yeah.
And that's not the same thing, you know, so they're two different tracks. And I think it has to be more of an invitation, like, well, we don't know what that looks like. Because even if I declare and say, oh, we want to build Black spaces with intentionality, most people like Black people in our community believe like when you improve something, when you build something like this, it's not for them. Just in like, this will then cause gentrification. This will mean now that this will be something that the goods and services will now follow. And just think how deeply that's ingrained in, like, that's the expectation in our culture.
Yeah.
That we've kind of sequestered. And I think for climate change and food and land access, these issues around, because there's now climate action, like we have to detangle that. Because why shouldn't, you know, a community that doesn't have a lot of quote unquote wealth in terms of the fiat, in terms of money, be penalized or not have access to the quality of a healthy ecosystem?
Yeah,
Right?
I think this gets to the heart of this other question that I had for you all. And then there's some questions in the chat too that are starting to emerge too. But Anton, one of the things that and Anton and Brittany, one of the things that came up in our center survey, we sent out a survey to a bunch of stakeholders, and noticed that academic scholars and community leaders, they're really interested in trust as a pressing issue of the time. And I think it's related to the last roundtable in Trust and Theory, we talked about responsibility, who takes responsibility and what that looks like and how it's executed, how you show that. Anton, you just mentioned trauma, the specificity of that. And Brittany, you talk in great detail about how we need to relearn. And we also talked about unlearning the last roundtable as well. How do you relearn or be very intentional with your rhetoric and your words of how you talk about reclamation? So I wonder if either of you have thought about trust in your work. Food is a catalyst for trust, land is a catalyst of trust, or is trust even the right word of something that we should be thinking about fostering?
Who's up? Anton.
Well, I mean, I think the first thing we have to define is like who the we is. Like who's the we that we're trying, like, is the we in the institutions or the city? Like what we're struggling with is now the we has been like the city, but then like who is the city, right? And the city are the people, but then the people really are just the bureaucrats who are making decisions. Even I think this is a part that folks don't, forget in like participatory democracy is like, yeah, you have an elected official, but then it's like the people who actually are making the decisions that have the discretion that these policies, like they can be checked, but they become so like, one-offs. So like who then holds the power is often, and then like, then once you acquire it, right? So it's like then moving it from the more, ephemeral kind of like, I got the land. Then like, what does the power of that then mean? And this is a larger kind of philosophical, like, we don't have the answer, because in American culture, it's around that land is valuable as a leverage for money. But is that the right context? Is the land should be valuable for like not just money, right? That it's just because it needs to grow these kind of restorative, phytoremediating kind of plants, right? And maybe it is not aligned in quote unquote a beauty standard. Or what is that beauty standard even look like, right? In terms of a design element in a neighborhood. Because that then comes up in terms of like how people even feel like where they live. Yeah. Right. So we have a lot of questions around that, you know what I mean? And so I think there's leaning into like what, we build. And like, because even if you deliver land to people, it's like, the campaigns of this is what we're dealing with often in, most places, but in Chicago right now, it's like, creating the mechanism, the organizers and the activists pushing for things, and then we win. And then having said power, the we, then it's like, well, what is the we really to create now to build it?
Yeah.
Right. And then what does that then take? Because then I have the right to the city. But then now that I have the right, does that mean that I'm going to be then a great steward of that? Or will I repeat some of the same practices, which is like, I want to try to get money. I want to develop a high rise there. You know what I mean? So there's a lot of, and I'm not saying that is a right or wrong. I'm just saying that those are the things that we don't discuss them. They kind of get, hemmed up in that way.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a you're almost speaking to like, do you trust yourself in this larger system, which is really an interesting way to like just check yourself, which is something that also came up a lot in the last roundtable. Brittany, I turn it to you.
Thanks for the question. Such a great question. I love thinking about it in preparing for this. And I think I kind of want to start by just telling a little story. So the Shinnecock tribe, their ancestral lands where they still live are on Long Island. And in their original treaty, their lands were made smaller once by settlers, and then the treaty was broken and they were made even smaller. They were relegated to like the marshiest part of the Shinnecock Bay on Long Island. If you look at that map, that's pretty much co-located with what is now the Hamptons on Long Island. So you have this juxtaposition of one of the poorest areas in New York State, the Shinnecock Reservation. And then you have the Hamptons with billionaire homes and, you know, the Indian Hills Golf Course, which is literally like what it's called, hosting the, I don't know, I'm not a golf person, but like the PGA Tour maybe, or some cup, Masters Cup, I don't know. Like you have these two worlds side by side. And as the Hamptons is getting more and more developed, ancestral burial grounds are getting turned into billionaire mansions. And at the same time, the septic systems of those mansions are polluting the Shinnecock Bay. So you have dead zones, you have toxic algae blooms, and you have a municipality that doesn't know how to solve the problem. And the Shinnecock, one of their ancestral practices is growing kelp. They have traditionally farmed kelp, and kelp filters 20 times more carbon dioxide out of the water than the same acreage of a forest can, 20 times more. So they want to create a kelp farm as an answer to the ecological destruction that's going on around them, and as a desire to reclaim, again, that word reclamation, their own practice. But they've been relegated to the marshiest part of this bay. So there is no clean coastline for them to be able to manage something like this. But a group of people who were consistently showing up to the protests of the development of their burial sites were the Sisters of St. Joseph of Brentwood, New York. And they had a coastal retreat. They have still a coastal retreat. It's like a house, a retreat house on 9 acres that is right on that same bay. And so Becky, the elder of this group, approached one of the sisters, Joan Gallagher, and said, hey, we want to start this kelp farm, but we don't have a place to do it. And the sisters were like, this is not even our land to begin with. Like, we're already in this struggle with you. We've already seen the destruction you have faced. Of course, whatever you need. And so that kelp farm is happening off the sisters' land. They've converted one of the buildings to be the hatchery. It's ShinnecockKelpFarmers.org or com if someone wants to find it and think, or I'll put it in the chat after I'm done chatting here. But so now this kelp farm is happening, and there are conversations about what long-term access, again, so that, you know, there can't just be a decision like, oh, we don't want to host this anymore. Those conversations are happening right now. But yeah, one of their buildings was turned into the kelp hatchery, where the baby kelp is seeded until it's ready to go into the bay. The sisters have donated a car to one of the farmers who was having transportation issues. Like, it's such a story of solidarity that started because sisters showed up where the Shinnecock were in their struggle for their own reclamation. And so connecting this to like, where does trust play in? I think that there's trust, like, I know that this is going to work. And there's trust, like, I believe in the truth of this, right? Like, what is true about what's going on? And I think, I mean, speaking like particularly to, you know, white folks with resources or people with land resources, it's like, this is not about knowing 100% about whether this is going to happen. Like, this is not about the question, what if they build a casino on this land? Like, we have failed in the paradigm that European settlers have brought. And the trust that we need to step into is, what is true about how this all came to be? And how can we act from a place of right relationship to do that work? So yeah, I know I've gone on a little bit. I don't know, Nicole, if this is the moment to talk about the doctrine of discovery, or whether I should save that, because that's kind of the bedrock of it for me.
Yeah, I see that someone had put the Shinnecock Kelp Farmers website onto the chat for everyone to see. And I'm also going to invite those who are part of the webinar here and are watching via Facebook to just put questions in the chat. And we'll get to them. I wanted to give space for Anton to respond, and then maybe we can shift into Doctrine of Discovery.
Awesome.
Now, I don't have much to add there. I think it was so powerfully put in terms of like, this process of our country having to deal with, which is still hasn't quite dealt with it, which is this kind of really a truth and reconciliation kind of like piece that has to, like, our future depends on it. It's like we keep like not trying to do it. I think this is because it's so contentious right now, and there's such a cantankerous spirit amongst Americans, you know what I mean? And there just seems to be, and we're still a young country, so even like when you travel to other, countries across the globe, you realize like how fragile this is, but how unique and special it is. And that this what we're really dealing with is, that this notion of a white Christian nation does not exist, which is still for many what they think of America as, or should, be seen. This is what America is. But we all know that is no longer the case. And I think that what we're living through is just the kind of breakdown of the global white domination theories that have kind of brought us to the brink of like non-existence for humans, and not calling that thing out now. But because then it moves beyond like, because for whiteness or blackness, these things are like, have no scientific bearing anyway. We know these things, right? So I think that we'll be moving closer towards this, like we're living through it, because it's so kind of like all we know is what was, in a way. And so, as Toni Morrison says, we always as humans, want to go back and romanticize the story of the past, and add our own flavor to it. But that is, that is not true. And that's leaning into like, there is something else that is emerging. And I think that is disrupting this kind of social order. That's why there's so much pushback and vitriol, because there's fear underneath. I think the 80s were like a lulling period, maybe. Thinking back now as like a hip hop, like just to place myself in the context of the story of like what America possibility is and was, just because that was what was being sold, that we kind of had moved beyond, that we kind of had some racial reckoning, but we really did not.
Yeah.
Part of that was just the shellacking of, but it tapped into what humans want, which is like, we're not defined, our relationships with each other are not defined by our skin color. Because we're going to hang out if we have, things in common, or that, the way that we're wired, we're, attracted because we're so opposite. You know what I mean? So like, that's the reality of America, you know what I mean? But we still have these same kind of nodes. And I think that what's been fascinating for us is like, when you're in nature, its principles are not, based on these kind of frail human principles though. You know what I mean? It is, definitely always equitable. You know what I mean? Like, it's always in motion and moving. Because it's not disconnected, that the death is not collected, like the death is necessary for something else to live. Or even how we assign, like, but in nature, it's just like that, they go away and they replenish. You know what I mean? And they come back. It's like this, this ebb and flow. And so sometimes it's like, the trees are part of this whole like ecosystem of a mycelium that's talking below, and the winds are just blowing through, right? Blowing through all of us, you know what I mean? And it's taking and germinating these things. And now we're just in a place of crisis that I'm confident that we can correct. I think that's also what's missing in the climate conversation, is like, there's no hope.
Yeah.
It's so like fear-based. It's like, well, what can you do? And that's what is paralyzing most people, is like, it doesn't matter. And that's kind of like what we have to kind of recenter that, because we live in such a more automated world because of technology, that it makes everything feel like it doesn't matter what you do, that it's a foregone conclusion. And that cynicism is what has poisoned our well in this country.
Mm.
Because people have resigned to like, it doesn't matter what you do, it's never going to change.
Yeah.
But that is like not what's happening always in nature. There's always shifting and changing. Always.
Yeah, and the
You know
more
what I
that
mean?
we're collecting the scientific data, the resilience and the adaptability of plants and animals and even atmosphere is really
It's changing.
interesting. Yeah,
I mean, it may still be a forest to the naked eye, but you know, but it's not the same forest it was last year.
no, no,
Right. So it's just like just us as like, for me, that's what kind of like why this space resonates with me. I think resonates with so many people, like because it becomes a centering.
Hmm.
So, but I'm going to be quiet now because I want to hear about the doctrine.
Yeah, the doctrine, and maybe it links also to this question in the chat. I think like just like a clarification about being involved in any work with Catholic nuns who are donating land parcels to environmental stewardship organizations. I think there's just a reclarification point. Yeah, pulling that together if you can, Brittany.
Great. Yes. I mean, yes, these stories are happening and we're trying to support them to become a real movement. I told the story about the Sisters of St. Joseph. And kind of our role as an organization is we're digging up these stories and case studies and playing them back to our community to say, this is possible, it's happening. There is a way to live this out in your community. You know, so it's Callie Walker, the Methodist minister who donates her 100-acre farm to a collectively owned Black regenerative farming cooperative outside of Richmond, Virginia. It's Lisa Lee Haynes, a Quaker woman who returns 30 acres to a collective of Oneida women. I'll drop our learning platform in the chat, and you know, we interview and talk about all of these examples, and what we are trying to support and specifically accompany is religious communities who are going to be, you know, who are looking at the future and are gearing up for or discerning letting go of their land to say, how do you what does it look like to center that planning process in these kinds of ideas and this ethic of repair and regeneration. So absolutely, and hopefully more in the future. And I saw another question about storytelling in the chat. I mean, that's and maybe I'll tie this all in. So I'll start by saying 3 weeks ago, actually to the day, 3 weeks ago, the Vatican formally repudiated the doctrine of discovery, which is it's the set of papal bulls or decrees that basically, they are the decrees by the Pope in the 15th century that paved the way for the colonization of the world. I mean, 83% of the land mass on the globe was colonized by European forces by the 1920s. And for the transatlantic slave trade, it said that non-Christians didn't have souls and that non-Christian land could be occupied and was open to discovery, basically, that if there aren't Christians there, you can discover it. And I almost want to look up the exact wording here, but it doesn't, you get the point. It was formally repudiated, and the Catholic Church and Pope Francis formally apologized for the harm caused by these papal decrees. This is something that people have been pushing for decades and centuries in some ways, but like actively for decades. And two reasons why it matters. One, the foundational US property case in the Supreme Court, it's one of the first cases you learn in your first semester of law school in your property law class, Johnson versus McIntosh. And it was a case in 1823 between two white landowners, one who had bought a parcel of land from the state and another who had bought the same parcel of land from a tribe that said that they were the owners of it. And the case ruled that, and I will actually find the wording for this because it's cited that discovery is the foundation of title in European nations and therefore overlooks all proprietary rights in the natives. That was the first property case heard by the US Supreme Court in our country. So everything else that has precedent, that, you know, it's the foundation of precedent in US property.
I'm sorry, Brittany, can you wait? I'm sorry. This is such like a look. Let's go back right quick. I know this is like a webinar and I'm the panelist, but I feel like I'm in it also on the other side with the attendees. So can you repeat that again for me?
Yeah. So this case,
yes,
the state owns this land, not native people, because we have the right of discovery of the land. And what they used to back that up was the doctrine of discovery. So it's cited into a US Supreme Court case in 1823 that set all of the legal precedent for property in the United States today. So it is written into our laws that discovery is what counts. So we have European nations creating their own rules and then punishing everybody who doesn't follow them, right? I mean, that's what this means. And so, and this was cited as recently as 2005 by Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Like, this is not a left or right issue. This is literally the water that we're swimming in. And so for me then, talking about, I mean, that is a hard thing to not feel cynic about. Like, that is like, talk about like, oh, it's all built on a fallacy created by the church and other colonial forces too. But I mean, the church was a huge driver in this. But then the question becomes, and then when we talked to our community about the repudiation, we were like, this could be the opening for the moment in which we choose a different story. Like, and this is where, you know, this is trust in action. That's the conversation we're having today. It's like, that was a story that was extremely successful in being embedded into our culture today. And it's still the story we're living in. We can't choose a different one unless we're aware that that's the story that's playing out. And so to me, it's like, okay, if we don't want to operate in that, we have to be really, really intentional about how we move forward. And then it's like, I was thinking, maybe it's less the word trust, but the word truth. It's like, how do we act from a place of truth about what is real about what's going on and what's needed? Because I think trust sometimes, then it gets, especially for my work, which is like the action I'm trying to support is land rematriation, land reparations, land regeneration by people who have control of land, which is often white people. And so operating in trust, it's like, then white people still have the power of saying, well, who can we trust to care for this land? And instead it's like, what's true and what's needed and how do we act from there? Because that, it just feels like, I don't know. It's like, yeah, how do we get out of the old story? And I'll just, sorry, I'm bundling up a lot here, but yeah, I think
I'm so fascinated. I mean, this is manifest destiny. So that's like, okay, this is the
this is what
of manifest destiny is like the doctrine of the discovery is what is, you know what I mean? The basis of why I can then execute a manifest, like it's all right. But it then gets me to thinking about that there's, you know, a new narrative in particular around this truth and trust, which is in my mind, like the work that we're doing, which is the kind of the doctrine of abandonment. They give us the right that you abandon and left for, you know, and left these spaces, you know, in worse condition. So just have my mind just kind of twirling a bit around like, you know, what is the doctrine that we're then, you know, because it's somewhat of a doctrine of a discovery. It's like you left us here. It's the city, like in our case, it's the city owns land that people have like found no other use for. Like, I don't want to locate there. It's too many it's too much gun flyer. You know what I mean? It's too many black people. It's too many of everything. So we're not bringing any of our business here.
Yeah.
But then that makes the state culpable though, also, because then that's not, then you're not serving your function, because then why am I paying you taxes?
Right.
Then, well, what are you taxing me to do if you can't provide the foundational platform? Those are larger questions that then Black people should be asking in context of, like, in our work specifically, right? Because it is in that kind of that truth and trust then has to have some actions about it. I can't just talk about it. I got to be about it.
Yeah.
Right. I have to then demonstrate. It's just like, people like, we can't do reparations. Like, well, the hell, yes, we can. You know what I mean? It's possible. And it looks like said X, you know what I mean? It's like, then, you're forcing the corporate to do business with a cooperative that is owned by the people or something of that nature. I mean, it could take on many different forms, but then also embedded, what I heard you say is that there's also this, outside of that context of that system of capitalism, right? Which is the exchange of, but there's something else there that I think that is that's also part of this narrative piece. Like, you know what I mean? That we're moving beyond the white picket fence era of that. Like, that's the guarantee. That there has to be another guarantee because the climate is changing. And we're all like, it doesn't matter. These things that we came up with. So it's like one big catastrophic thing that takes out a major American city happens. Then will that be the reaction? Now, can we then react? It's kind of like what I think what happened with the pandemic. It's like, oh, now we can, really give money in these. We can have George Floyd happen. Like, this is what they mean.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And it's not that people don't know. It's just that when people are confronted with, such the stark reality, that there's only one other choice in that sense. So, but I appreciate that, Brittany, because I'm like learning and like connecting the dots as well. So thanks.
Yeah. I have a question for you that's kind of related to story. I'm seeing Nicole. I'm looking at Nicole first though, because you're our guide here.
Go for it. In these last 15 minutes, I think you all really tied together beautifully the questions that we do have in the chat. And I'll just note that someone did say they suggested reading An Indigenous Peoples' History of the United States, which is a great book. And we should add it to our book club too. We also have Leah Penniman's book. We have Monica White's book going into some of this history as well, and how it's particularly impacts the Midwest. But yes, please go, Brittany. Go for it.
Great. And there's a switch. Thanks to our interpreters. I'm seeing you make the switch and just appreciating you. Anton, my question is just like, you're talking about the resilience you're trying to build in Englewood, right? And I'm just like, there's this bigger story and this question about story and this bigger shift that we want to make as like how we're doing as human beings. And the work is so place-based. And selfishly, I want to get more glimpses of the work on the ground. Like it's like, what's the scene playing out when you think of the work you're doing, and for folks on the call, the webinar, to hear from you. So I'm like, what are some glimpses of it, but how do you see it as connected? It's that, like, I know small is beautiful, that whole like way of thinking of this, the small things matter. They bubble up to a narrative change, but how do you see that? Do you see that happening? How do you see that connection? And I
think that there's some of that happening. I think in any community you have, like, especially how, even our organization grew out of like a coalition approach to like bringing people together, like, cooperative approaches, creating spaces where you have other multiple voices, intergenerational voices, the diversity in terms of just, who you're bringing from in just kind of the Black community in large, in this, Englewood and West Englewood, which, where Chicago's lost most of its population, have been in communities like Englewood and West Englewood over the last 30, 40 years. So when you hear the headlines of like how many Black people, like almost close to 1 million Black people have left Chicago, right? Over since the 80s, like 850,000, somewhere around that number. And many might have moved to like the suburban areas of Chicago, or they moved to Atlanta. A lot of people moved to Atlanta. A lot of people who went away to school like just moved to Atlanta. So I think like on the ground, what it looks like for us is, having to create the tools that we don't have, and then working in partnerships. So we're that's what makes our work a lot easier, is that we have, folks we create networks, and we work with others and figure out ways to further the intersectionality of the work, that it can't be. And that takes a lot, because you still have to run an organization, there's still the kind of day-to-day of like getting stuff done, because it's the theoretical piece that has to be maintained and challenged to even lay out a blueprint of what's possible. And that takes a lot more time and is necessary, because then what will you build if I don't have great blueprints? Right? Or if I created the blueprint and only went off of what I thought. Right. So it's the design process. And what I've seen over the years was there's much more influence in terms of a city process that exists now. So a lot of our work is and so we got a long way still to go in terms of changing how the city even works with community, or how they even deal with community. And there is movement around like people who are internally wanting to figure that out. And part of the codes and the kind of laws, the constraints of the law were created because, in like a city like Chicago, you have so much like the machine, quote unquote, extracting so much resource. Right. And it still is, that's the framework. Like the majority of Chicago is the 70% Black and Mexican city. Most people don't know that. They come here and it looks like it's like almost all white, but it's not.
Yeah.
Chicago is 70% Black, specifically Black and Mexican. Right? That's a unique feature, right? And I think that, part of like what the struggle continues to do, like on the day-to-day, like what does that look like, is that these racial constructs also silo people, because there is not solidarity between the Blacks and the immigrant communities. Right? It's on an individual level, but in the American framework, it's like these folks are coming to take something from me. So the kind of well of like, the human nature of like, I want to be able to keep something more for myself is part of the human story. Yeah. But that's not like, it's not absolute either. You know what I mean? Like that's not always, doesn't always have to be the case. But I think that the people who have been in power, that has been the way that they've seen success or victory. This gets to what you were talking about, Brittany, because that's from a colonial point of view of what success looks like.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Or how they define, it's like, how people see themselves in the world.
Yeah, well, and I actually meant, what are the glimpses of the work happening at Greater Englewood that are breaking through that? Like,
so like that requires us to like be in partnership to then like create new systems and like challenge, like this project was like something that the community had talked about, like, well, what could we do? And that was like 15 years ago. That was a long time ago. Right. And so like when now people read about it or write about it, like, oh, it's like the 60s, it's something that exists now that is then tagged with like, oh, that's gentrification, right? So people then think that they know, but then they do a little bit more discovery. It's like, and that's why I have to get out and be like, you don't know, right? So I have to also correct people. It's like, oh, it's not. But then it's also what I talked about earlier is to break through that the last veneer is like even Black people in a Black community around like, what does that mean when you improve your community yourselves? And that is so attached to then like it becoming more like I have buildings with coffee shops and glass and steel. And that is the success. You know what I'm saying? Like, that's how I can see that this neighborhood is, turning better now that it's like a condo that costs $500,000.
Yeah.
Like that whole system is whack and ludicrous. It exists. So what we're trying to figure out is strategies that break through that. And so what we're, and through that, some of that is the solidarity economy. like trying different ways in which, we're using the capitalist market, because capitalism is not all zero. It's not zero because there's a reason capitalism exists as a system that we all buy into, because humans, like, as much as we like to be in a collective, we like our own individual spaces, freedoms to be able to be like, okay, well, I'm not doing what the group. That's humans, all of us in our families, with our partners, like, time out, I need my own space. Right? So it's not like it's null and void from the conversation. So what we're trying to do is really work with some of those frameworks to say, okay, like, well, how do we attract this, or how do we grow this? So that's a lot of what our day-to-day looks like, is like, when we build $100 million project, how do we get our folks really working to build this?
Yeah.
Right? Because there's no, like, it's all great, because then it's like this is being done for the community, but then when it's time to actually do it and the contracts are out, who are the people who are actually getting the work, the money to actually build the thing? Do they look like the people in the community? We know that they don't. But the system, so like, that's what you're talking, that's our day-to-day, is like, then this, like, we have to first identify, like, what's the barriers, right? That, like, a Department of Transportation prevent that from happening.
Yeah, I think
you know what I mean? Like that, and it's codified.
Yeah.
And it's like, then I'm not even included on, like, and then it's like, well, how come I can't compete? Because I don't have the capacity. Then it gets to the capacity issue. But it then goes back to what you were talking about, Brittany, is like, then when you do a real analysis around, it's like, well, these companies, these groups, and this is the thing that always fascinates me about the private industries, like, they're all publicly initially funded to get started, right? They get these big contracts, and then those contracts become subcontractors, provides goods and services for the big projects. And that's kind of how that economy of scale kind of grows.
Yeah.
Right. Because then they're at the front of the table. And it's like, by the time you get to, the minority vendors, it's like, well, you have this slice. But what the minority vendors need is like the bigger slice, because we're so, but our culture doesn't want to give that up. So we can't go, and our approach has been stealth at some point. And it's still, some of it is like, strategies we had to come up with, and be like, okay, we got to figure out other ways for this to work. Or we'll always just be like, oh, we have 5 Black folks, and then we can kind of parade the 5 Black people who worked on the project.
Yeah.
Right. And that's not a measure of success. So that's what's really the ongoing work still, is like, how do we, because you need elected officials who are competent, who know, you know what I mean? Because the expectations, like, when they get elected, that they know all these things. They do not. It takes a lot. Advocacy, it's like all the tools in the toolkit. So that's kind of, and then what we're doing for this process is documenting what we're going through. So by the time we have this kind of agro-eco district plan, and, because we know, as an organizer, we want to embed what the benefits for the community would be on the onset. Right. And, we're being bold, like, the people who own over here, like, clean their taxes up. To me, it's like the folks over here who have endured, a heat wave. If you've never seen the documentary Cooked, this is the neighborhood that happened in. The high levels of violence, of the drug wars, decimated Englewood and West Englewood, public housing, the whole mortgage fraud crisis in the country is being predicated here in this kind of city in Chicago, in the Midwest, where speculators are taking on the streets that people like never visit, and triple and quadrupling the values of that, right? Knowing that people in the neighborhood, the median income is $20,000. So why would you be building a $400,000, 2-flat in 2005?
I feel like we almost need like a whole, like, just like
I'm sorry,
session on the economy.
I got all,
No,
we're almost
it's
at time, but this is a great conversation though. So
it is, and it's like very clear that like the systems approach really demonstrates like how much that knowledge, and you need that history. You need to understand how interpersonal relationships. You need to understand how like the infrastructure of a city works or a place works to do this action, and it's really wonderful. So I wanted to extend appreciation conversation for both of you. And I'm sorry that we're at time and I have to segue back to the Turners, but I really hope this is not the end of the conversation, that this is just the beginning. So thank you to you all. And I'm for those who are listening right now, this roundtable has been recorded and will be available online. It will also be available as a text publication at a later date. So until then, we invite you to further engage with these topics through the 6.5 Minutes With podcast, the Interactive Book Club, and our Food Journey survey, which will actually, we will actually activate that with a story cart this summer, which will visit various places across the city of Milwaukee to gather stories about how you gather your food. So for updates on those summer events, we invite you to sign up for our listserv. And I hand it back to Emilio to announce upcoming Turners events. Again, thank you for this wonderful discussion.
This was a great panel. I'm happy to listen to Anton and Brittany all day. So we'll try to do a part 2 sometime. Thanks again. And as we mentioned, we were all thrilled. The whole office is here listening. And for those following us on Facebook and here in Zoom, as we mentioned earlier, this program has been recorded. We encourage you to share the Facebook edition of this with other Facebook groups. We will alert you all via email when the finalized episode is hosted by C21 and the Turners. Big thank you again to DJC Interpreting. Great work as always. And if you're interested in supporting the work of the Milwaukee Turners and our work, please visit us on Facebook or visit our website, milwaukeeturners.org. If you're interested in being a sponsor of the Vel Phillips Forum or seeing some of our previous episodes, you can once again visit our website. And we are really excited to invite you to our very next, this one will be a hybrid Vel Phillips Forum episode here at Turning Tables Tavern downstairs, Thursday, April 27th at noon. We're kicking off the Jewish American and Asian American APIDA Heritage Month, which is celebrated in May. The episode is entitled Fighting Anti-Semitism and Anti-Asian Hate Through Education. And it's going to highlight model programs that are teaching AAPI history and Jewish American history, as well as a proposed amendment to Act 31 that would direct school boards to provide instruction on Hmong Americans and Asian Pacific Islander Desi Americans. So please register to attend in person at Turner Hall or virtually. The link will be shared in the chat and also on Facebook. Either way, I hope to see you here at Turner Hall before and after each home game of the NBA playoffs. Go Bucks, no offense to my friend from Chicago. And until next time, please take care of one another.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Anton.
Pleasure, everybody.